Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm sorry I haven't got a bigger gong, because clearly it was extremely difficult calling for silence. But anyway, my name's Giles Delabany. I'm part of the Lignacite team, and just want to extend a very warm welcome this evening. This is our 13th lecture in the series, and it's very nice to see some old faces and lots of new ones as well. So, art and architecture. Somebody said to me last week, go on Giles, get concrete blocks into art. And I have to admit, it's been something of a challenge. But I want to start really with where Lignacite started, very briefly. And it's a concrete block company that was started by my grandfather 69 years ago in Suffolk. This is the old engine shed next to the station where the steam engines were pulled in and worked on. And we've made concrete blocks from this factory we made them in here for 60 years. And subsequently, we've invested in a great deal of equipment. And I'm afraid it's poor, but this is the closest I get to art. You will get the proper art later on. The point of this slide really is just to say, I think it's very important to continue to invest in the business. We are passionate about what we do, and we very nearly went bust 6 years ago. We're delighted that we didn't, and we continue to invest and to innovate in the business. Now, normally at this point, I talk about wood and the fact that Lignacite is called Lignacite because the Latin for wood is lignum, and hence the name of the company, and we put wood into our blocks, and it makes them warm and light and smooth and good in a fire, and it locks up CO2. And in fact, we have produced the first carbon negative block, we think, in the world, which locks up more CO2 than is released in its manufacture. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm actually very quickly going to talk about some more recent innovations and collaboration. About 10 years ago, we started looking for other materials, and one of the materials that was glass. And I thought it would be a lovely idea to produce a modern stained glass window type out of recycled glass. So we made a block of 100% recycled glass with some white cement, and then we tried cutting it very, very finely, so that if it was put up in a building, the light would come flooding through and it would look stunning. Didn't work, of course, like most good ideas. But what did happen was that Alex de Rijk from DRMM came along to look at our wood, fell in love with our glass blocks, and as a result, at the time, his practice were working on one of the projects for the Olympic Village. And after about 7 iterations, we ended up with a beautiful green glass bit of masonry, bedded in limestone and then planished. And we then had to go out and source the glass. And we found it very difficult to source single colour glass. So we had to resort to sending our employees out to drink a great deal of wine, which they did heartily. We brought the bottles back, we put them under a steamroller, and then we put the glass into the limestone and we started to make the blocks. Only to find that the Olympic Delivery Authority changed their minds and said, actually, all the buildings have got to be brown and white, at which point we had to redouble our efforts and go out and drink a great deal of beer. Now, the point of the story really is that we've continued with a very close collaboration with the RMM, and we've been involved with them on a number of projects over the last 10 years. This was, I think, the next project, which was in Blackpool, and obviously we have the sea behind. So again, glass in a block, in a Roman brick format, and clearly they've stepped it in and out here. And then we've got what looks almost like a clinker sort of prow of a ship, again on the seafront. Because it was Blackpool, and this is a registry office, they wanted a little bit of bling. And so what we did was we put luminescent powder-coated glass into this product. And so during the day, the sun warms it up, and then at night, when it gets dark, it gently glows. More recently, at Rathbone Market, we've worked very closely with Adam West of CZWG, and again, for them, we produced a completely unique block that had never been made before, from the flint from our quarry, and again, some glass. They wanted something very robust and tough at ground level that would take a good battering in that part of London. So whether it is a crematorium, and this is Crown Hill Crematorium in Milton Keynes, designed by Adrian Morrow, who is here. And I think it's worth saying, I think this is the most beautifully and carefully detailed building we've ever supplied masonry to. It is an absolutely stunning building. Or a Sikh temple, this one in Leamington Spa. This was built 5 or 6 years ago. It was entirely paid for by the congregation. There are, to check my notes, 340 different specials that they wanted on this building, and it looks completely stunning. A project we didn't work on, unfortunately, is St Martin in the Fields, but I'm sure will come up in this presentation. So really the point I'm trying to make is whatever the building is, we are very interested in innovation. We're very interested in working with you in collaboration when we can. We have 4 Bs in Lignacite, and they are beautiful, bespoke British buildings. And that's what we very much passionately believe in and want to be involved in. So that is my very, hopefully, brief introduction. And now we're going to do the proper stuff and come on to our main speakers. So Eric Parry doesn't really need much of an introduction, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background. He studied architecture at Newcastle University and the Royal College of Art and the Architectural Association. He established Eric Parry Architects in 1983. The same year, he was appointed lecturer in architecture at Cambridge, where he taught for 14 years. In 2006, he was elected to the Royal Academy. He and his team have developed a reputation for delivering beautifully crafted and well-considered buildings. London has been the focus for much of his work, and he is the mastermind behind One Undershaft. I got that right. Not knowing much about One Undershaft, I talked to one of the members of his practice when I was there last week, and this is, and I quote what he said. He said, "Oh yes, yes, that's a building with a rude name that keeps going up and down." And I think what he meant was that it started life at 270 meters, it then rose to 304 meters, and I think now has settled back at 294.6 meters. I'm not sure. Eric is not looking convinced by any of this. But anyway, I understand it will have 73 floors. It will be the tallest building in the city and the second tallest building in London. So in addition to his work in architectural practice, he serves on the Kettles Yard Committee, the Canterbury Cathedral Fabric Advisory Committee, the Mayor's Design Advisory Panel, the Council of British School at Rome, and is an Architecture Foundation trustee. There's actually a lot more stuff, but I really didn't think I could say it all. So I'm going to move swiftly on to Vivian Lovell, who is the founder-director of Modus Operandi and also has a great number of letters after her name. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and an En Friba. And you of course know what an En Friba is. I didn't know what an En Friba was, so I went online last night to have a look. And the first entry was actually for Friba chips, and I'm pleased to tell you that they are available from Scotch Frost of Glasgow Limited, and they come in large, extra large, and simply enormous proportions. Nothing to do with being an En Friba, however. Vivian founded Modus Operandi in 1999 as an independent consultancy. She has championed the field of art in the public realm since the late 70s, hard to believe. She has been involved in generating many collaborative projects between artists, architects, and other design professionals. And as well as her interest in chips and all things Italian, she is currently chair of the Faculty of Fine Arts in Rome. They are both unbelievably busy folk, and I'm very pleased and grateful that they've given up time to come and speak to us this evening. So hand it to yours.
Well, actually, it fills me a huge amount of pleasure to be standing next to Vivian doing this, because it lends the other half, in a way, to a conversation which I think should be very much part of the normal routine. Imagine a world stripped of the hieroglyphs on obelisks, or of the contemporary sculpture that we cherish, actually, around cities. In a world now, I think, that's kind of pretty denuded. So, I just think that there's an issue of meaning that Vivian's going to come to. But I think we're going to both start, and I'll start with a few slides about where the origins of a desire to work collaboratively stem from. And in my case, I think there are beginnings that are earlier than this, but I think there's something to be said for schools of architecture that share a territory with a school of visual arts. And I was lucky enough to go to Newcastle upon Tyne, as Giles mentioned, for the first 3 years of my architectural training. And there, at a kind of moment in 1970, things were still bubbling pretty furiously on the education front, politically and so on. I shared a lot of time with my artist neighbours, something to do with materials, where you had a cup of tea, very simple things, but it was convivial and mingled, I would say, rather than collaborative. And there is this sort of heady background of Richard Hamilton having recreated Marcel Duchamp's large glass, Victor Passmore teaching, and between them and a few others, they organized this extraordinary adventure with Kurt Schwitter's only extant Merz piece, the Merz Barn from Elterwater, which was falling rapidly into decay. So it's 1947 when he's making this, his only surviving piece of this kind. And so they organized for its removal from Elterwater and brought it to the art gallery in Newcastle upon Tyne, in the University, the Hatton Gallery, where, having backed it and moved it, an incredible journey from west to east, it settled and was available for us to marvel at. I have to say that one has a sort of sense of its importance in retrospect, no doubt. The other, so this is embedded art, and the other side of this was also a person who lectured to us, Elsie Evetts, who had produced a classic analysis of the Roman lettering at the base of Trajan's column, which stood at a height of about 18 foot. There are these 6 lines. Each line decreases over the 6 to an order of about 3/4 of an inch. The spacing changes. And he did these exquisite descriptions of the way that the letters were produced. And we had to evoke this, but then it passes. That's the first kind of exercise that we did. But it's amazing how it comes back. Those two issues, maybe the delicacy of typography and lettering and cutting and making, and this masterpiece that had been salvaged. So in a way, I think There's much else besides, but I've dragged those two memories to the surface because they were, in retrospect, incredibly potent.
Thank you. I've dragged 4 memories from the past, and passions have to start somewhere. And this one was as a 4 or 5-year-old on a family holiday in Bexhill-on-Sea, where the enormous ship of a building, the Delaware Pavilion, was between the little hotel where we used to stay and the sea. So it was there as this enormous landmark and featured very largely in my childhood. And running through this amazing building, I'd come across this Edward Wadsworth mural, which has been restored recently. So the relationship of art to architecture, before I even knew what real art and real architecture was kind of imprinted very early on. Then flipping to Time Life Building, the Henry Moore screen, which is an interesting and early important example post-Second World War of art in relation to architecture, art for architecture. I just want to quote from Henry Moore, who wrote at the time, I think architecture is the poorer for the absence of sculpture. And I also think that the sculptor, by not collaborating with the architect, misses opportunities of his work being used socially and being seen by a wider public. And it was feeling that at the time, that it was coming for architects and sculptors to work together again, that brought me to do a double commission, this one, and also his draped figure, which is a freestanding sculpture. So interestingly, intrinsic to this architecture was the work of not just Moore, but Geoffrey Clark and Ben Nicholson, and was one of the reasons why this building was listed. I was actually contacted in the late 90s by the new owners of this building who wanted me to advise on replacing a Ben Nicholson relief. I went along keeping a very tight mouth, went back and wrote a letter to AJ and other outlets saying that this surely should not happen. The building was listed and the artworks with it. David Smith was a very strong influence on me as a teenager. His amazing sculptures, stainless steel sculpture, arising out of the landscape as pure art form in relation to the environment, was one of the passions, I suppose, that drove me towards a career in art beyond the gallery. Coinciding with that a little later, I should say, at university reading art history, I was interested in patronage when it was very unfashionable. Art history was taught very much style, feeding upon style at the time. And I was reading Arnold Hauser's The Social History of Art and becoming interested in artist-led groups like Artist Placement Group, who believed in the artist working in relation to society, in relation to industry, the incidental person in those settings which were way beyond the gallery. Back to Eric.
Thank you. Well, a number of overlaps, not least a 5-year stint as a night guard at the Serpentine Gallery, which included a wonderful show of David Smith drawings.
Yeah.
Amazing, amongst many others. Here, though, in a way, this is, from the architecture perspective, is cut somewhat into 2 sections, 3 sections really, about materials, the first of which is stone, and leads to metamorphosis through the work of Joel Shapiro, as I'll come to, and another great sculptor, Stephen Cox, with whom we've collaborated a number of times. Just starting with this idea of how you use stone, and with this project at Pembroke, which is now 20 years old, the brief was for 100 student rooms. The question was a kind of integrity, once working with stone, was to make for each room a celebration of the occupant through a lintel that was 3.3 meters long. So over each of these single lintel. And I think that kind of question of making things out of one piece is incredibly important, and historically certainly has been. And it translated to a project in Savile Row with the use of stone, which is almost prescribed in this instance, taking down a building that also used stone, and looking at different ways in which the stone might be used, a weave or a more traditional regressive organisation on the left, which is the one that Westminster Council chose and kind of forced somewhat. It's a building with a very tight wall that's all about skiography. It's the first time I had used a string course to define a horizontal condition to the wall. And it was really hidebound, it felt, by the office program internally and by the constraints that were imposed planning-wise externally. And I desperately wanted a release, which seemed to me to be the entree for the potential collaboration between artist and architect. And I chose, against the very rigorous organisation of horizontal and vertical, Joel Shapiro. And it took 6 years to get this sculpture in place through 2 ownerships, and an extraordinary sort of passage. But if the stone is cut, and having made, for instance, with the Pembroke College, more than 20 visits to quarries and mines to establish what quarry was, here it was given as Portland. But there was an incredible battle to actually establish, again on this, lintels of a single piece here. So the joint is absolutely critical. There are 100 and something pieces, and we had to prove that it would be possible to get that number on a commercial building like this. But the beautiful thing was that Joel's pieces, all these elements are cast in one too. They're singular, amazing pieces. And those obsessions with jointing seem to me to be absolutely critical. This is him in his New York studio, thinking about the first iteration of a series of elements that then come together in a maquette. They're most beautifully made maquettes in timber. And then his way of working is to recreate in slabbed timbers the form, which is then cast in one piece. So there's a complete joy, actually, in and danger. And ultimately, it comes down to the question of patination, which is a deep-rooted issue. You know, how traditional, how dark it should be, how light. An extraordinary conversation with him about that to get to the final piece, which, as you see, is not finished heavily. And as the first piece he had done that was suspended is held by these 6 wires, which kind of beautiful engineering moment. But just in terms of the use of the material, you maybe hark back to Mr. Everts in Newcastle, and this building, which we've completed recently, it's St. James Square. It has the building on the square. It has Apple Tree Yard. It has a resonance because next door, which is part of the project, in fact, at number 7 St. James Square, is a building that Lutyens designed, and the Farrer brothers, for whom he designed it, then lent him the Mews, and it was in the Mews at Apple Tree Yard that he laid out New Delhi, and he made the Queen's Doll's House. And this kind of extraordinary world that's completely forgotten and blown away. But with Stephen, it was possible to evoke this in these huge bulks of granite from India, basaltic material, but also to work his figure. And I've always been fascinated by his work with stones. He works in Egypt, he works in Italy, he works in India a lot. The Indian stones particularly can be taken from a picked, light French grey, to a jet black. And that's exactly the way that the building is finished. This is picked granite, this is honed granite, this is slightly more sharply honed granite. It's an amazing palette that I've learned from him in a way, but his piece, which came out of an 18-ton singular piece of stone, ends up, as it were, emerging from this building at this point. So that's a little about stone and the metamorphosis of material.
So continuing on materiality, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my role as a curator in this field. And that's through research and knowing about artists and continually looking at art and researching new people to encourage this dialogue between artists and architects and others, including engineers and landscape architects, and to enable the artists to make a work which is distinctive, which may be integrated, but is clearly their work within a broader palette, as it were. The starting points might vary. They might be as varied as placemaking, focal points, decoration, commemoration, celebration, traditional reasons for commissioning art, creating narratives. They may be as basic as meeting planning conditions or meeting lottery requirements, as was the case with the young Vic, where I had an urgent phone call from Steve Tompkins of Howth Tompkins to say they had to get an artist on board within the next month because it was part of their lottery conditions for the building. And through fast research, we identified a short list of artists who would, I think, begin to understand not just the architect's approach to this experimental new building, very low cost, but also the theatre's way of working, which was experimental, a lot of young people involved. There was a sort of basic sense of provisionality about it. And so it was beginning to think about artists who were working in a way that could find an equivalent form and collaborate with the architects. And we identified Clem Crosby, who's a painter. Through studio visits, he was finally appointed. And here, art is literally part of the architecture. We're looking here, obviously, at the lit facade at night. The studio shots you see here, top, right and left, are some of the many 263 paintings by Clem Crosby that inhabit the space behind the metal grille that he and Steve selected together, which obviously looks one thing by day and another by night when it's lit between the two surfaces. And this, in fact, part of the whole facade of the building was taken to the Venice Biennale recently, about 5 years ago, is that right? Yeah. To the Venice Architecture Biennale, and displayed as an example of an artist and architect working together. But the starting points might also be shared interests, shared concepts, shared passions, friendships that can generate a dialogue. Steve Tompkins also, through his love of the colour red, developed a friendship and collaboration with the artist Anthony Malinowski, which led to a whole series of commissions at the Royal Court and other theatres. So here it's part of the artist's role to help express the meaning and the character of the building. And I think that's something that should be explored, the way in which art can use metaphor and narrative to help create new meanings in architecture and public spaces. With the BBC Broadcasting House Public Art Programme, we were appointed by the BBC and worked closely with MJP, the original architects for the building. It's completed, of course, by Shepherd Robson. And you see here a CGI of the 3 permanent commissions that arose once we had developed a public art strategy, which is an important point for this talk, that there could and should be a strategic approach to art in relation to architecture in the public realm. It's not just a question of picking ad hoc one artwork for each building, but having a sense of overview of the master planning of the area. Working with the BBC Public Art Group, which was established for that purpose at our request, chaired by Alan Yentob, we developed a strategy and organised 3 concurrent international competitions, which were won by Mark Pimlott, Martin Richmond, Tony Cooper, and Jama Plenser. We are looking here at the artist-designed public space where no such public space existed before, by Mark Pimlott with his winning scheme that imagines you're walking on part of the world and that the BBC, through its World Service unites parts of the world that are well known and lesser known. So place names, lights and sounds inhabit the paving, which is deliberately kept free of any freestanding sculpture, so any type of event can happen there. So this, in a sense, the public space becomes a metaphor for the BBC itself at its best. Light was a very strong theme throughout. We relit All Souls Church, that Grade 1 listed church, by Richmond Cooper, and Jama Plenser was commissioned with a work that emerges from the building, creating, in a sense, a trilogy of towers with the BBC radio mast and the post office tower. And there could be a 4th tower, which is, of course, the All Souls spire, on which the sculpture is based. It's actually like an inversion of the spire. And then throughout that whole program, we ran temporary commissions. I'll just show you one of them. That was by Rachel Whiteread, who cast Room 101, which was going to be demolished under the refurbishment scheme, and Rachel and her team chose to cast the whole space and make a sculpture out of that room, which became a metaphor for suffering, a metaphor for the body under torture. It was shown, scars and all, in the surface in the V&A cast courts, where the V&A invited the artists to position more famous casts, including Michelangelo's David, in relation to the work. So a long and very active program which brought the BBC in touch with many of its neighbours and schools and colleges in the area. So, Eric.
So I return to the question of materials, but it is interesting that the first example, in fact the first 2 examples, were very much intuition about the collaborative process with an artist, and a kind of certainty of, with risk, naturally, but a certainty that there was a dialogue to be made. This is a short passage about a huge material in ceramic, and a building. This is the Holborn Museum in Bath, where the ceramic, the glaze of the ceramic is used as a crafted part of the making of the building, and it's not an artistic project in itself at all. It is a key differential, it seems to me, in this dialogue between, the industrialized process, the process of craft, and then what art and visual art can bring to a scheme. So, in fact, with ceramic, the first iteration of the use of glazes was with John Mitchell at Wimbledon School of Art, following his geometric obsessions with shadow and conoid sections, and translating those into this pixel form with bricks. But moving to a collaboration between architect and artist. This scheme for Piccadilly with Richard Deacon has been a very important one. And indeed was an important part of the planning process, because there was a lot of opposition to losing these buildings. And you can see the architects, Waterhouse, wonderful, and then up the road. There was an attempt to make a kind of boulevard. This dropped away, and this was seen to represent a period between Nash and the 1920s. So there was a lot of desire in terms of Westminster planning department to hold on to it. In short, the idea was to reintroduce this horizon and create a new building where there had been three facades and rework the existing building on the corner. And you can see in this very early sketch, there's this sort of sense of a double height border to these big openings, and there's a cornice which is rolling over the top. And in conversation, this is a drawing before the artist's commission, just showing a sectional form and an idea of something that was there. And actually there's more kind of art in the dripping surround to these double height openings within the drawing than in the cornice. But certainly in my mind, the idea was to create a canvas that would be part of the body of the building, which I had already determined would be ceramic, a white ceramic, and that this would be about a process of polychromy. So I suggested to the Crown that they needed two advisors, and were able to get Paul Morehouse and Richard Cork to join the Crown in order to judge a process of shortlisting from 6 great artists working with polychromy, which finally ended with the work of with Richard Deacon, whose beginning was very different to the end. But I must say that I had been captivated by Richard's work with ceramics and the Cologne studio that he worked with for a long time, and had been with him in his studio looking at some of these incredible pieces that wouldn't actually withstand frost, so they weren't suitable for the exterior. And his first idea was a kind of like scagliola, or the mixing of plasters. His first idea was this idea of mixed pieces which were then cut to create the cornice. But clearly there was a problem for us in terms of the consistency of the body of the building and the building ceramic. He then developed, after a series of iterations, the 39 pieces that span the 25 meters or so of the building, and with a proportional height. But he defined this wonderful idea of sectional interest. So you can see in the cutting of that mixed plaster the idea of sectional separation. So this is then his definition out of a sketchbook that we then reiterated of these sectional differences. And he started to think about what these faces would be, and produced 30 colour ways that he painted in acrylic on card. And that needed then to be translated into the ceramic. That wasn't easy. We had to find, there was the question of whether it would be painted by studio artists in the factory, or whether it could use another process of transfer. And we caught the rump end of silk screening with transfer in Staffordshire, and worked with the factory in Darwin, shores of Darwin, to produce in the end, through many failures, a balancing of the kilns in the two places to create the intensity of colour that Richard would sign off. Here he is. And this is the cornice laid out with many gaps, because there are many failures on the ground in that process, which then led to a brilliant moment of his, that is to say that the exposed cheeks would be white. giving the lie to any sense of these being singular. And then all the facets were worked out by Richard in order not to create a repetition. Very careful working through that, which led in the end to his sculpture called Piccadilly. And so it is. People. It's incredibly powerful, but it takes its place in a very civilized way in the street as a kind of. It's a piece that is absolutely geared to the uniqueness of the place, which obviously, is this hub at a meeting point in terms of London within the ordering of the whole. But it's an interesting process through competition to get to a point where, for the first time in his life, as a sculptor, he's made a piece that isn't applied to a pre-existing kind of condition or placed, but actually grows out of the body of the material of the building that it inhabits. I think I'm going to do this run-in before we take this. So this is really our penultimate coming together, because we've worked on many projects that I haven't illustrated through this. But this was a kind of just a project about great ambition and necessary ambition for change. So I'm just going to paint the picture of where the project was and what we broadly did very quickly before we get to a very, very critical point in the project's manifestation of the Art Advisory Panel. Here it is, St Martin in the Fields. It's actually a site, it should be said, that it's both the Gibbs Church, completed in 1726, and the Nash Range of the mid-19th century, and all the Undercroft. So it's a kind of site, actually, the size of the centre of Leicester Square, though you register it as different elements. And of course, Nash set the building, which was originally surrounded by medieval fabric. So what we did was to create, between the Nash and the Gibbs, an enormous basement that has a light well to give air to the plant room here, double height spaces, a hall, a music rehearsal space, and then above that, at the upper level, here are the double height spaces. The kitchen that cleared was originally in the crypt, drawn back to create more of a space here. And then the inverse of the light well, the pavilion that takes you down for the 750,000 people who come here with its shop. And then the centre for care, the connection at St Martin, taking up the bottom level of the Nash Range and the ground floor, and indeed in part all this end from Adelaide Street. So above ground, it was about a distillation and a clarification of all the elements. The sacred entrance leading from the shadow of the west to the light of the east, reworking the east end, creating a condition where this could be fit for a liturgy of 80 or a memorial service of 800 and for music, and then clarifying entrances. So I won't go further into that, but it was about connecting in both dimensions below ground, given the highly sensitive nature of the building, cutting the railings back to make the space in which these elements could survive. And the cross-section here with the crypt restaurant, jazz, a space of congregation here, the hall, and up. And a sort of sense of material that begins to work here in its early stages of stacked glass for metaphoric reasons. But still, as you may know, the wonderful model, Gibbs model, exists with much that is manifest, but alternatives on different sides. And it's about here, this extraordinary ambition of cutting the fabric to make the square, originally with a building for the Royal Academy in the middle. And that the carving away of graveyards and things to connect in an almost landscape sense the building in a new urban setting. So Nash's plan, the great column, which was always to be lower than St. Martin in the Fields. And this is what it was. It was a kind of labyrinth of spaces that leaked, were designed, as the vicar said, for the dead, but used by the living, with 8 kitchens, scattered around the space, and actually kind of absolutely falling to pieces. So we commissioned Chris Steele Perkins to make a series of photographs, of which I'm only showing you a few, but they're really emblematic of the state as it was, coming down into one of the vaults to seek shelter for the night. It's not a hostel. That centre during the night, and the state of the church, which had its glass bombed out and still had the remains of a polychromatic scheme that cut against the Georgian condition paid for by Harrods for a regal moment in the late 19th century, to a dais that got in the way, and a potential minefield in terms of the battle between the Georgian group and the Victorian Society, for whom this represented an equally potent moment. So.
And not forgetting 20th Century Society and the Parochial Church Council and the Diocesan Advisory Council and Westminster City Council, all of whom had to give permissions. I was introduced to this project by Eric, so thank you, Eric. It's been probably the most fulfilling project I've ever worked on. And I was introduced to the vicar, Nicholas Holtham, at the time, who was now Bishop of Salisbury. And he saw the need for an art programme. The first commission, in fact, was a new Christmas crib, which is designed by Tomoaki Suzuki, a Japanese sculptor who knew nothing about Christian narrative and researched it all. That appears every year in Trafalgar Square and is delightful and conveys the narrative in the most minimal way possible. But the major commission that we had to start with after that was, of course, the East Window. And it's salutary to see the previous image and a reminder of the horror of the interior decor. Many people are attached, just going back, to that blue cross, which of course was post-Second World War. So there was a whole lobby in support of that, who didn't imagine that anything as contemporary could possibly be commissioned. My advice to the church was to assemble an arts advisory panel, and that's been meeting ever since. And it's been chaired by Sir Nicholas Goodison, who I'd worked with before, commissioning Anthony Gormley for a major piece in Birmingham before The Angel of the North. And Nicholas was chair of the Art Fund, and he'd also been chair of TSB Bank and chairman of the Stock Exchange. So he was very well placed, shall we say, to chair such a group, which introduced interests of art history, but also the parishioners themselves. So it was a mixed group. The process we went through was to write a strategy and then to start competition process. So we longlisted, we shortlisted, we selected, and the designs by 5 artists for the new East Window were shown in the church and public comment invited. They were pretty hostile. And eventually the art advisory panel agreed on Shiraze's work, but that was turned down by the Parochial Church Council. If we just fast forward, her original design was what you see on the right, which, as you can see, is a more taut, sort of vortex-like design than the final work, which was her second design. Both were inspired by a Zurbaran painting of the Veil of St. Veronica, because for Shiraze, the warp and the weft of the veil was very important as a means of conveying her imagery. So we see here in the winning design, which finally was implemented after all these permissions were gained, as being a metaphor for the cross, for a face without a face. People choose to read Christian iconography into it if they wish, but the artist is totally open to interpretation of any kind. You see on the right how the piece looks by night when the ellipse is very, very brilliantly lit from two lights either side of the sanctuary, which are hidden sources of light. And as the daylight falls outside, the light on the ellipse comes up. Both sides of the glass are etched, and the challenge, one of the many challenges of this project, was that Sherazade had not worked significantly in glass before, nor actually made a work of this scale before. So we had a lot of convincing to do, but of course through design developments, Price and Myers engineers with Benson Sedgwick, who made the shot peen stainless steel framework, and with Meyer of Munich, who with a glass studio we recommended that the artist collaborated with, it was able to prove to even the greatest skeptics that this piece was going to work. Of course, you know, one thinks one knows what something like this will look like, but there's an amazing shock. I don't know if you were shocked, Eric. You know, we'd seen it close too, of course, by going up scaffolding, but to walk into the church for the first time and see this piece was quite astonishing. And what it does actually is reunite the interior of the church with the exterior, which for decades had been sort of blocked off by the previous glass windows. So it reconnects the church with the rest of London, which is emblematic of the way the church works with its homeless and with its Chinese communities and so forth. What Sherazade was aiming to do was to create these wonderfully subtle etched marks in the glass that were derived from the way that she made these gestural marks in her paintings, which are incredibly beautiful, labor-intensive objects. Because it was such a public building and these commissions are of the significance they are, we also went into an invited competition for the altar, and again invited Sherazade and her partner Pip Horn to compete for this, and they won with a beautifully elegant, simple, yet very meaningful work made out of travertine stone. It's lit subtly from within the top surface, but it just appears to float there in the sanctuary, which, as you can see, it's not quite as clear as that now. There are some very beautifully designed chairs by Eric and also some flowers there. But between us, we'd managed to convince the church to clarify that space, so the east window and the altar really sang out as significant objects in the liturgy. But you can also read it as a metaphor for the body. The fissures, the artist said, in the stone were almost wound-like in their form, if you cared to read it in that way. We went on. I'm not going to show you all of the commissions, but just two more. We went on to commission metalwork for the main altar, the processional cross by Brian Catling, and his maquette you see here on the right. And his winning idea was that if you wanted to make a cross, you had no materials to make it out of. What would you do? You might find 2 sticks and then some binding twine. And this became the starting point for his cross, which is cast in aluminium and gilded with gold leaf. Outside, the poet Andrew Motion was commissioned by the church to make a poem which winds its way around the handrail of the light well, which connects above and below ground. And at the bottom of the light well, you can look up and see the spire of the church. It's a stroke of genius by Eric, one of many. And it was realized, this poem, by the letterer Tom Perkins, very beautifully designed and set letters into that handrail. And then below ground, there's a chapel to Dick Shepherd, who started the homeless program post First World War, when soldiers were stumbling out of Charing Cross Station and going to the nearest point of refuge, which was St. Martin's. And Eric designed this altar. The church has been lent the most beautiful tapestry by Gerhard Richter, which you see behind it. And on the right, you see the metalwork we've commissioned for this altar, which is by the Italian goldsmith Giampaolo Babetto. Finally, I'd like to just end with a couple of images to widen the discussion out and indeed the whole nature of approaching art and architecture out into one which is more strategic, which I mentioned earlier. And we have been developing a strategy over the last 5 years for the Radcliffe Observatory Quarter in Oxford for the University of Oxford. And working with a site-wide artist, Simon Perriton, on ideas for sculpture and integrated artworks throughout the site. And that's been slow in the process, but the point is that it's a more strategic approach to placing art in the public realm and in relation to the buildings on site. And one of the first temporary commissions that took place was by Susan Collins, which lit the Radcliffe Observatory, and indeed the lighting changed colour according to the movement of the wind and to temperature. And then finally, the image of the art strategy plan for Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, which is another project where Eric suggested that modus operandi was involved, and we've been working closely with that client group, with the Historic Dockyard and all of the amazing institutions that are there, the Mary Rose Museum, the National Museum of Naval History, HMS Victory, HMS Warrior. It's quite extraordinary, the history and the resonance, and the first task and major task that is still to be completed was a competition to redesign the public realm, which was won by Latz and Co. Landscape Architects. And they brought onto their team Andrew Motion and also a German lighting artist who've been developing ideas for embedding work within the spaces. So that's at its very earliest stages, but some very exciting possibilities which we hope to develop together. So,
no, I think that just to say this is Poacher and Gamekeeper, because here it's a fantastic unrequited site, and I sit on the trustee board of this with the intention of drawing a very disparate set of buildings together through public space and the art strategy. So, very different role.
Very happy.
And open up new possibilities of innovation, which is just exciting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the scale and the materials which are demanded by artists working publicly as part of architectural schemes means that there should surely be time for experiment. And I think actually a company like Lignacite would be an amazing setting for an artist in residence program, so people could develop ideas in relation to your product. For me, I think it's really exciting if a collaboration can start as early as possible.